Ontario Premier Doug Ford has gone viral in American mainstream media for being a complete disaster. So, of course, this has a lot to do with his performance during this pandemic. We are now in Ontario in the third and highest wave so far, averaging about 4,000 new cases of COVID-19 a day, which is higher than at any point during this pandemic. And a lot of this is because of the actions or lack thereof from Doug Ford. Now, as I've discussed in previous videos, of course, blame as well is put on the Liberals and Trudeau for their lack of vaccinations, and really the biggest issue being us having no vaccine producer of our own. We used to have one back in the 80s, then Conservatives sold it off, and Liberals, despite being in power for many years after that, never brought it back. And Trudeau, at the beginning of this pandemic, never thought that was an avenue worth going down. So, of course, blame on Liberals as well. But right now, with vaccinations or the vaccines rolling in at a more steady pace, a lot of the blame at this point is simply put on Doug Ford and the Conservatives in this province for completely screwing up the handling of this pandemic. And this is where we get to the Washington Post with this opinion piece. Doug Ford must resign. This written by David Moskrop. Incredible piece. I will link to it below the video. It goes over a lot. I'll quote a bit of it in a second here. But it became the number one story on the Washington Post when it came out on Sunday, showing you that there is a lot of interest right now, not just in Canada, but internationally, in terms of how Canada is doing. Because Canada, up until really this year, had been performing better compared to other countries. But once the vaccine started rolling out and Americans began getting their shots, those in the UK began getting their shots, Canada and our lack of performance during this pandemic, or our complete screw up in terms of how we're at least treating it right now, really took the spotlight, as we have been doing terribly compared to other countries now. And Ontario, of course, being a big reason for that, considering the population of the province. So this became the top story. And just a day after that, despite all the accurate complaints or criticisms in that piece, this is what the Ford government decided to do, blocking the Ontario NDP motions to mandate the government deliver paid sick days, which, as I did a video on over the weekend, is a major piece of why this government has failed so far. You have frontline essential workers, those in grocery stores, taxi drivers, transportation workers, people that work in large factories like Amazon warehouses. These people are still not the priority of the vaccination rollout. The best they've done so far is hotspots. They're now prioritizing certain hotspots and trying to get the vaccine to 18 plus people in those regions, but still not focusing on who need the vaccines most, who are the ones that are spreading COVID-19 the most, the ones that are ending up in the ICUs. These are the essential frontline workers, and paid sick days would go a long way to helping to alleviate that, allowing people in these positions to stay home if they feel sick and not risk giving COVID-19 to the public or other people in their workplace. But Doug Ford, throughout this pandemic, has been against paid sick days. They also blocked repealing new police powers, which I will get to in a minute here, guaranteed paid time off to get vaccinated, shut down non-essential businesses, establish support programs for small businesses. So the Ford government just blocked all of these motions. On the police part of this is wild. Ontario police can now stop you just for being outside. This is the strictest COVID-19 measures in North America. So the new orders, which carry a $750 fine for a first offense, effectively confine Ontario's 14 million people to their homes, save for a handful of permitted activities. Now, to my surprise, a lot of police across Ontario, Toronto, Hamilton, Peterborough, others have stated that they're not going to do this. So despite giving these powers to essentially stop anybody, this is what the Ontario government thought was a great idea, allowing the police to literally be able to stop anybody that is outside, be it you're driving somewhere in your car or you're walking around, allowing the police to stop you and ask you where you're going, what are you doing, And of course, that would lead to, in all likelihood, racial profiling and clearly giving police orders that impact civil liberties. So again, this is a conservative government essentially trying to create a police state here. And to my surprise, many of the police departments have came back and said they're not going to do this. But let me read just a paragraph here from this piece. And it goes into more than just Doug Ford's failure during this pandemic. It's really Doug Ford's failure overall since he became premier. Ford was never fit to be premier of Ontario. The pandemic didn't reveal that. It just bathed it in the garish light of emergency. Both before his time in provincial politics and since, he has shown no distinction other than his extraordinary capacity to alienate, divide, and fail. And the failures are many and epic. As I argued in 2018, he brought U.S.-style culture wars to Ontario. He interfered in local politics during an election and desecrated Toronto City Council. He froze the minimum wage and rolled back protected paid sick days. He cut Toronto public health funding and library funding and legal aid funding and flood funding. He opposed safe injection sites. He couldn't even figure out how to produce license plates that work. The list goes on and on. So a lot of these I have already covered in separate videos over the past several years. But, freezing the minimum wage, there was supposed to be an increase in wages. He stopped that. Rolling back paid sick days. Finally, the Liberal government at the very end, before Doug Ford came in, decided, hey, people should have paid sick days. We had 2 paid sick days. Doug Ford took those away. Minimum wage was going to be increased to $15 an hour. Doug Ford took that away. So he has been a complete disaster, not just during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic. And this paragraph speaks to that. Now, to show you again just how bad it is here in Ontario, Dr. Barb King here tweets out, unless you have a 70% chance of surviving your intubation/resuscitation and ICU care, you will be allowed to die. This is coming from Critical Care Services Ontario in the days ahead. We've all been put on notice. So the ICUs are getting filled to the point where they now have to make these hard decisions where if they don't think you're going to make it, then they're essentially going to allow you to die, to be able to prioritize the ICU for those that they think have a better chance at survival. So we are filling up the hospitals now with COVID-19 patients because of these 3 new variants, because of the lack of support being put forward by the Ford government. And it really is just a complete disaster. Who would have thought, a year ago, that a year into this, we would be at a worse place now than we were at the top of this pandemic in April, May. But every wave has been worse. The second wave was worse than the first, and the third wave is worse than the second. Now, in addition to Washington Post calling for Doug Ford's resignation, others are also. So the leader of Ontario's official opposition, Andrea Horwath, told Global News Monday, quote, "Of course Doug Ford should resign. He refused to listen to experts and instead marched us into a brutal, horrifying, and deadly third wave. People are losing their lives, people who would have otherwise made it through this. Ontario deserves so much better," Horwath continued. Also on Monday, Ontario Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca issued a press release calling for Ford's resignation, writing bluntly, quote, "Doug Ford is the worst premier in Ontario history at a time when leadership matters the most." So everyone here now calling for Doug Ford to resign. This shows you the real power of mainstream press and, especially American media. Once you, as a Canadian, go viral in America for being a disaster, that really begins to set the tone for the rest of Canada to recognize how much of a disaster you really are. So good to see these calls, but obviously, he's not going to resign. It's Doug Ford. That said, this, of course, he should not be in power right now, and there's so much that he could be doing. This alone would go a long way. And this would also be listening to the science, not just, random calls from politicians. These are calls where you are listening to the science and what are the scientists saying? What are the experts saying should be done? This is what should be done, and he's ignoring all of that. Last thing, I want to show you that his approval is dropping, continues to drop. So this from Abacus Data, approval now at 34%, down 5 points, and disapproval at 44%, up 7 points. So this was taken on April 15th. I would like to see what his approval rating is this week. I think it's going to get even worse. But it shows you, at the very least, the silver lining here is that people are aware of how much of a disaster Doug Ford has been.